Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of family, forgiveness, and the unexpected twists. Enjoy the story! Margaret Thompson slowly rose from the small bench in front of her daughter-in-law's grave. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. She gently closed the gate of the small fence surrounding the plot, her arthritic fingers fumbling with the latch. "I'm going now, Valerie," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. "I'll be back soon." As Margaret made her way down the winding path of the cemetery, she couldn't shake the heaviness that had settled in her chest. Lately, she'd found herself visiting Valerie's grave more and more frequently, though she couldn't quite explain why. There was a nagging sense of guilt, as if both she and her son had somehow betrayed Valerie. Deep down, Margaret knew that Valerie would have been happy that David had found a good woman, that her daughter, Margaret's granddaughter, wouldn't grow up feeling like an orphan. But still, the guilt persisted. Valerie had died during childbirth. Their relationship had been good, not exactly close, but pleasant enough. It wasn't until after losing her daughter-in-law that Margaret truly understood what a wonderful person Valerie had been, and how selfish her own son could be. As she reached the cemetery gates, Margaret paused, memories flooding back. 3 years earlier. The doctor's voice was grave as he addressed David and Valerie in the sterile examination room. Margaret sat quietly in the corner, her presence a silent support for the young couple. "Mrs. Thompson, given your medical history, we strongly recommend a planned C-section," the doctor explained, his eyes serious behind his glasses. "It's the safest option for both you and the baby." David, his face set in a stubborn frown, spoke up. "And if our child can't be born naturally? I've heard that C-section babies aren't as smart or physically developed as those born naturally." Margaret watched as Valerie's face fell, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. "David, that's not true," Valerie said softly. "I've shown you articles." "Articles can say anything," David interrupted. "I want what's best for our baby." The doctor tried to interject, explaining that C-section babies faced no such disadvantages, but David had made up his mind. Margaret could see the defeat in Valerie's eyes as she nodded, agreeing to attempt a natural birth. Later that evening, Margaret cornered Valerie in the kitchen. "Sweetheart, why this heroism? David won't love his daughter any less if she's born via C-section. Leaving a child motherless, is that really what you want?" Tears welled up in Valerie's eyes. "I understand, Margaret. But David's become so cold towards me lately. It's like he thinks I'm defective or something. And I'm starting to feel that way too." Margaret's heart broke for the young woman. She tried to talk to her son, but David brushed off her concerns. "Mom, don't be dramatic. The doctor said there's a 25% chance everything will be fine. We'll definitely be in that 25%, you'll see. Valerie's strong." But David's confidence was misplaced. Margaret would never forget the look on her son's face when the doctor delivered the devastating news. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," the doctor said, his voice heavy with regret. "We did everything we could, but your wife's heart couldn't handle the strain." David stared blankly at the doctor, his face pale and drawn. "No, this can't be happening," he whispered, his voice rising in panic. "I have money. Do something. Anything." The doctor shook his head sadly. "I warned you about the risks. I'm so sorry for your loss." As the doctor walked away, David slid down the wall, his body racked with sobs. "Mom," he choked out, "what have I done?" Margaret could have comforted him, told him it was God's will, but she remained silent. She saw the state her son was in, and knew someone had to handle the paperwork and funeral arrangements. With a heavy heart, she set about the grim task, leaving David to grapple with the consequences of his stubbornness. 3 years had passed since Valerie's death. David had struggled to come to terms with his loss, but Margaret had given him little time to wallow in his grief. Little Sophia needed constant attention, and to David's credit, he threw himself into fatherhood with a dedication that surprised even Margaret. About 6 months ago, David had introduced them to Tiffany. She was beautiful, with long blonde hair and striking green eyes, but there was something about her that made Margaret uneasy. She was quiet, almost too quiet, and there was a coldness in her eyes that Margaret couldn't quite place. Margaret knew she should be happy for her son. After all, didn't Sophia deserve a mother figure in her life? But something held her back from fully embracing Tiffany. Instead, she found herself visiting Valerie's grave more frequently, seeking solace and answers from the daughter-in-law she had lost. As Margaret walked home from the cemetery, she decided against calling a taxi. The weather was pleasant, and the walk would do her good. She needed to clear her head, to shake off the melancholy that had settled over her during her visit to Valerie's grave. When she arrived home, she found the house quiet. David was out, probably at work. Margaret tried not to leave Sophia alone with Tiffany too often, not because she didn't trust her new daughter-in-law, but because she didn't want to burden her unnecessarily. After all, Sophia wasn't Tiffany's child. They needed time to bond, to become friends. "Tiffany?" Margaret called out as she entered the house. "Where's David?" Tiffany's voice drifted from the living room. "Oh, he had to rush to work. Something broke down, I think. He said he won't be back until morning." Margaret frowned. It wasn't like David to leave without saying goodbye to Sophia. "And where's my little angel?" "In the bedroom watching cartoons," Tiffany replied, not looking up from her phone. Alarm bells went off in Margaret's head. Sophia didn't like cartoons. In fact, she was one of the few children Margaret knew who actively disliked them. Something wasn't right. "I see," Margaret said carefully. "Well, I think I'll take her for a walk. The fresh air will do her good." As Margaret headed toward Sophia's room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong in her son's household. That evening, after their walk, Margaret tucked Sophia into bed. The little girl had been unusually quiet during their outing, and Margaret's concerns had only grown. As she kissed her granddaughter good night, she made a decision. Instead of turning off the baby monitor in her room, as she usually did when David was home, Margaret left it on. She told herself it was just a precaution, that she was probably overreacting. But as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she was glad she had followed her instincts. Just past midnight, a voice crackled through the monitor. Margaret sat up, her heart racing, thinking Sophia had woken up. But it wasn't her granddaughter's voice she heard. It was Tiffany's. "I can't stand them anymore," Tiffany was saying, her voice low and venomous. "We need to do something. The best option would be if they both died. They're just in the way." Margaret's blood ran cold. She pressed the monitor closer to her ear, straining to hear every word. "The old hag has her own apartment," Tiffany continued. "She should just take the little brat and live there. But no, she has to help her son. Did anyone ask if we needed that kind of help?" There was a pause, and Margaret realized Tiffany must be on the phone with someone. When she spoke again, her words made Margaret's heart nearly stop. "Listen, I've been thinking. Maybe we could slip them something, or just the kid. You know, something to make her behave erratically. David's exhausted from work. He won't be able to handle her behavior for long. Can you find me an expert in this area?" Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. This woman, who her son had married, was plotting to harm Sophia, her own stepdaughter. "Money's not an issue," Tiffany went on. "At least the idiot's good for that. He doesn't even look at what I spend. I was careful at first, but now I just use his card. He never checks." Margaret heard footsteps, and Tiffany's voice grew fainter as she moved away from Sophia's room. But her final words came through clearly, chilling Margaret to her core. "God, I look at that little brat sleeping, and I just want to smother her with a pillow. I can't take it anymore." Without a second thought, Margaret rushed to Sophia's room. As quietly as she could, she scooped up her sleeping granddaughter, blankets and all, and carried her back to her own room. She'd keep Sophia with her tonight. It was safer that way. As Margaret lay awake, holding her sleeping granddaughter close, her mind raced. What could she do? David would never believe such accusations against Tiffany. He was too besotted, too trusting, but she couldn't let this continue. Somehow, she had to protect Sophia. Little did Margaret know, the confrontation she dreaded would come sooner than she expected, and in a way she could never have anticipated. The next morning, Margaret was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when David walked in. He looked tired, his hair disheveled from a long night at work. "Good morning, Mom," he yawned, then frowned. "Why was Sophia sleeping in your room? Was she not feeling well?" Margaret took a deep breath. This was it, she had to tell him. Consequences be damned. David, sit down. We need to talk. Concern flickered across David's face as he took a seat at the kitchen table. What's going on, Mom? You're scaring me. Margaret sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Last night I heard something disturbing. It was Tiffany on the phone with someone. She was talking about hurting Sophia. David's face darkened. What are you talking about, Mom? Tiffany would never— Please, David, let me finish, Margaret interrupted. She recounted everything she had heard through the baby monitor, watching as her son's expression shifted from disbelief to anger. When she finished, David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I can't believe this, Mom. I never expected this from you. Tiffany's been telling me for weeks that you've been hostile towards her, but I thought she was imagining things. Now I see she was right. Margaret felt as if she'd been slapped. David, why would I make this up? I'm trying to protect Sophia. Protect her from what? David snapped. From having a mother? From being part of a normal family? I think you should go back to your own apartment, Mom. I can't deal with this right now. Before Margaret could respond, David stormed out of the kitchen. Moments later, she heard the front door slam. Margaret sat at the table, stunned. How could her own son not believe her? She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Tiffany enter the kitchen until she spoke. Well, looks like the old hag got what she deserved. Margaret looked up to see Tiffany leaning against the doorframe, a cruel smile on her face. You're going back to your place, and I'll make sure that little brat ends up in a home for the mentally unstable soon enough. Tiffany's laughter echoed through the kitchen, and for the first time, Margaret realized just how unpleasant it sounded. Tiffany? Both women froze at the sound of David's voice. He was standing behind Tiffany, his face a mask of shock and anger. I forgot my car keys, he said slowly, his eyes never leaving his wife's face. Mom, Tiffany, don't move. I need to get something. David disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Margaret and Tiffany in a tense standoff. Tiffany's face had drained of color, her earlier bravado gone. Moments later, David reappeared with a small device in his hand, a voice recorder. He pressed play, and Tiffany's voice filled the room, repeating the vile things Margaret had heard the night before. I installed this after Mom told me what she heard, David said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. I didn't want to believe it, but I had to know the truth. Tiffany's face crumpled. David, baby, you don't understand. I can explain. Get out. David cut her off, his voice ice cold. Get your things and get out of my house. If you ever come near my daughter again, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life in prison. As Tiffany fled the room in tears, David turned to his mother. Mom, I'm so sorry. Can you ever forgive me for not believing you? Margaret stood and wrapped her arms around her son. Oh, David, of course I forgive you. We're family. We'll get through this together. As they held each other, both silently vowing to protect little Sophia with everything they had, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The shadow that had been hanging over their family was finally starting to dissipate. In the months that followed, the Thompson family slowly began to heal. David threw himself into being a full-time father to Sophia, taking time off work to focus on rebuilding their bond. Margaret moved back in temporarily to help, her relationship with her son stronger than ever. One sunny afternoon, as Margaret watched David and Sophia playing in the backyard, she felt a presence beside her. Looking up, she was surprised to see her old friend Zoe. Margaret, is that you? Zoe asked, peering over the fence. I hardly recognized you. You look lighter somehow. Margaret smiled, gesturing for her friend to join her on the porch. As Zoe settled into a chair, Margaret recounted the events of the past few months. Oh, Margaret, Zoe gasped when she finished. I'm so sorry you all had to go through that, but I'm glad you trusted your instincts. Who knows what might have happened if you hadn't? Margaret nodded, her eyes fixed on her son and granddaughter. It was a wake-up call for all of us. David's realized that he needs to be more present, more involved, and I've learned to speak up when something feels wrong, even if it might cause conflict. And how's little Sophia doing? Zoe asked. As if on cue, Sophia's laughter rang out across the yard. "She's resilient," Margaret said with a smile. "Children often are. She misses Tiffany sometimes, which is hard for David to hear. But we're honest with her, in an age-appropriate way. We tell her that Tiffany made some bad choices and can't be part of our family anymore." Zoe reached out and squeezed Margaret's hand. "You're doing a wonderful job, all of you. Valerie would be proud." At the mention of Valerie's name, Margaret felt a familiar pang in her heart, but for the first time it wasn't accompanied by guilt. "You know," she said slowly, "I think you're right. I've been visiting Valerie's grave less often lately. I used to go almost every day, feeling like we'd somehow betrayed her, but now I think she'd be at peace knowing Sophia is safe and loved." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret and Zoe caught up on old times, their conversation punctuated by Sophia's giggles and David's playful shouts. When Zoe finally left, Margaret felt a sense of contentment she hadn't experienced in years. That night, as she tucked Sophia into bed, the little girl looked up at her with serious eyes. "Grandma," she said, "do you think Mommy Valerie can see us from heaven?" Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I'm sure she can, sweetheart. And I know she's very proud of you." Sophia nodded, satisfied with this answer. "I think she sent you to protect us, Grandma, like a guardian angel." As Margaret kissed her granddaughter goodnight and turned out the light, she felt a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe Sophia was right. Maybe Valerie had been watching over them all along. 1 year later, Margaret stood in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on a birthday cake. It was Sophia's 6th birthday, and the house was buzzing with excitement. As Margaret carefully placed the candles on the cake, she heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of excited chatter. "We're home!" David called out. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the living room. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw not just David and Sophia, but a woman she didn't recognize. "Mom," David said, his eyes twinkling with a happiness she hadn't seen in years, "I'd like you to meet Laura. We met at the park today." The woman, Laura, stepped forward, extending her hand. She was pretty, with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Thompson. Sophia's told me so much about you." Margaret shook Laura's hand, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. "It's lovely to meet you too, Laura. I hope you'll stay for Sophia's birthday party?" Laura glanced at David, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd love to, if that's all right with everyone." Sophia, who had been bouncing with excitement, finally burst out, "Grandma, Laura helped me build the biggest sandcastle ever, and she knows all about butterflies. Can she please stay for my party?" Margaret couldn't help but laugh at her granddaughter's enthusiasm. "Of course she can, sweetheart. Why don't you show Laura where she can wash up before we have cake?" As Sophia dragged Laura towards the bathroom, chattering a mile a minute, Margaret turned to her son. "She seems nice," she said carefully. David's smile softened. "She is, Mom. We've actually bumped into each other at the park a few times now. She's a kindergarten teacher, and she's amazing with Sophia." Margaret nodded, remembering how quickly Sophia had warmed up to Laura. It was a stark contrast to the child's hesitant interactions with Tiffany. "And how do you feel about her?" she asked gently. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded Margaret so much of when he was a boy. "I like her, Mom, a lot. But I'm being careful this time. I'm not rushing into anything. Sophia comes first, always." Margaret felt a wave of pride wash over her. Her son had grown so much in the past year. "I'm glad to hear that, David. And for what it's worth, I have a good feeling about Laura." The birthday party was a joyous affair. Sophia's friends from school arrived, filling the house with laughter and the chaos that only a group of 6-year-olds can create. Laura fit in seamlessly, helping to organize games and keep the children entertained. As Margaret watched Laura help Sophia open her presents, she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was David. "Mom," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for everything, for being there for us, for protecting Sophia, for believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. She pulled her son into a hug. "Oh, David, that's what family does. We stand by each other through thick and thin. Later that night, after the last guest had left and Sophia was tucked into bed, Margaret found herself sitting on the porch swing. The night was clear, stars twinkling overhead. "Mind if I join you?" Laura's voice came from the doorway. Margaret patted the seat beside her. "Please do." As Laura settled in, Margaret studied her profile in the moonlight. There was something about this woman that put her at ease, a genuineness that she hadn't felt with Tiffany. "Mrs. Thompson," Laura began, but Margaret interrupted her. "Please call me Margaret." Laura smiled. "Margaret, I just wanted to say, I know I'm new here, and I know you and your family have been through a lot. I want you to know that I respect that. I'm not trying to replace anyone or push my way in. I care about David and Sophia, and I hope that in time, we can get to know each other better." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I'd like that very much, Laura, and for what it's worth, I think you're already off to a wonderful start." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the gentle creaking of the porch swing the only sound. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "You know, I used to visit my daughter-in-law's grave almost every day, Valerie, Sophia's mother. I felt so guilty, like we were betraying her somehow by trying to move on." Laura listened intently, her eyes full of compassion. "But lately," Margaret continued, "I've been going less and less. And when I do go, it's not out of guilt anymore. It's to remember her, to tell her about Sophia's latest achievements. I think she'd be happy to see us healing, to see Sophia thriving." Laura reached out and squeezed Margaret's hand. "I'm sure she would be. And I hope you know, I'm not here to replace Valerie. I just want to add my love to the abundance of love Sophia already has in her life." As they sat there, under the stars, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead might not be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about the future. Inside, she could hear David moving around, probably cleaning up the last of the party mess. Sophia's soft snores drifted through the open window, and here, on the porch, sat a woman who might just be the missing piece their family hadn't known they needed. Margaret sent up a silent prayer of thanks, to God, to the universe, and yes, even to Valerie. Their family had weathered the storm, and now, finally, they were sailing into calmer waters. As the night wore on and the conversation flowed easily between Margaret and Laura, one thing became clear. The shadows that had haunted their hearts were finally beginning to fade, replaced by the warm glow of new beginnings and second chances.